Over a 10-week period in 1888, 5 women were butchered to death on the streets of East London. They were all murdered by a man who became known as Jack the Ripper. The trail of Jack the Ripper begins in the shadow of the Royal London Hospital in East London, just opposite Whitechapel Underground Station. Two minutes walk away lies Durward Street. In 1888 this was called Bucks Row. A man was in the area in the early hours of the 31st of August 1888 when he saw a tarpaulin. He pulled it back and found the body of a woman. The woman was Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old prostitute. The residents of Bucks Row were not pleased with their sudden notoriety, and by the end of the year the street had become Durward Street. Just as they do today, the newspapers sensationalised the story. Other murders were linked to this one. Local prostitutes accused a man they called Leather Apron. Now, leather aprons were worn in these days by Jewish butchers, carpenters and shoemakers. This was seized upon because Mary Ann Nichols had had her throat slashed. The leather apron theory was reinforced when on the 8th of September 1888 a second body was found. Anne Chapman, another prostitute, was found dead at 5:30 a.m. on the 8th of September. The second murder took place here on Hanbury Street, which is in the area of Brick Lane. Again the murder was gruesome. Her throat had been slashed twice and her intestines lay sprawled over her shoulder. The press latched onto this yet again. Lurid stories of a murderous immigrant incited mobs to attack innocent Jews. The East End teetered on the brink of a full-scale riot. Police flooded into the streets and the investigation intensified. Today, the place of Annie Chapman's murder is a disused car showroom. 200 metres up Brick Lane is the Frying Pan pub. On the night she was murdered, Mary Nichols was seen walking away from this pub. From here it's a 10-minute walk to the site of the third murder. On the way is a street called Mulberry Street. 2 days after the murder of Annie Chapman, a man was arrested at 22 Mulberry Street, which in 1888 was known as Zion Square. His name was John Pfizer. He was released as he had alibis for both evenings, and he was eliminated from the inquiry. 3 weeks later, 2 more prostitutes were murdered. Just a minute's walk from the London Metropolitan University is the site of Jack the Ripper's third murder. At 1 a.m. on the 30th of September, the body of Long Liz Stride was discovered. Elizabeth Stride's body was found in a yard here on Fairclough Street. Her body had not been mutilated, and the police believed that the murderer had been disturbed. Earlier that evening, in a separate incident, a policeman had arrested a local prostitute, Catherine Eddowes, for being drunk, and took her to Bishopsgate police station. Once she had sobered, she was released at about midnight. She walked away and into the arms of the Ripper. The site of the fourth murder is a few hundred metres from Aldgate Station. At 1:35 a.m, Catherine was seen chatting with a man. 10 minutes later, her body was discovered in Mitre Square. Her throat had been cut and her abdomen ripped open and savagely mutilated. V-shaped incisions had been made in her cheeks. Her eyes had been nicked through, and the tip of her nose had been sliced off, and her uterus and left kidney were missing. By an amazing coincidence, the site of Elizabeth Stride's murder and the site of Catherine Eddowes' murder both turned into schools. And this is Mitre Square today. It is hard to imagine that in 1888 a woman was murdered and mutilated at this spot. 1 hour after the murder, PC Alfred Long found in this doorway a piece of Catherine Eddowes' shabby apron, sticky with blood. It was after this night that the murderer got his nickname, Jack the Ripper. It was to be another 5 weeks before he committed his 5th and final murder. In the early hours of the 9th of November 1888, the cry of murder went up around the streets. The final victim was Mary Kelly, a 25-year-old Irish girl. She was murdered in a long-vanished passage called Miller's Court off Crispin Street. Today Miller's Court is a multi-storey car park. She had been so horribly mutilated her face was barely recognisable, and she had been virtually skinned. Despite several scares, this was the Ripper's final victim. He disappeared as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared 12 weeks before. The identity of the Ripper has never been discovered, and the suspects range from the grandson of Queen Victoria, the Duke of Clarence, to an American doctor. In 1910, Sir Robert Anderson, who at the time of the killings had been the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, wrote in his memoirs that the Ripper was a poor Polish Jew living in the neighbourhood. The man who headed the original investigation, Chief Inspector Swanson, pencilled into the margin of this memoir the name Kosminski. So we've seen the location of Jack the Ripper's 5 murders. Mary Ann Nichols in Bucks Row, which is today Derwent Street. Annie Chapman in Hanbury Street, near Brick Lane. Elizabeth Stride in Fairclough Street. The 4th murder, Catherine Eddowes, in Mitre Square. And finally Mary Kelly in Crispin Street. But who was Jack the Ripper? The true identity of Jack the Ripper has never been discovered, and over the last 130 years many suspects have been identified. The gruesome nature of the murders led many to believe that a doctor must have been involved. Even a member of the royal family was suspected. Most ripperologists, however, agree with the police at the time. Amazingly, he lived on the same street as the first suspect, John Pfizer. The man believed to be Jack the Ripper is Aaron Kosminski. But in truth, nobody knows.